So welcome everybody. I'd just like to start by saying sorry about the session last week, but thanks for joining us again for the 10th and final session of our SRMA Teaching Series. Today we'll be looking at getting your systematic review or meta-analysis ready for submission. And delivering the session today is Niraj Kumar. You'll have met him before, but for those of you who haven't, he's a current PhD student in cardiovascular science at the University of Leicester and previous medic from UCL. He's the founder and president of the NMRA and has worked on over 50 projects. Just a reminder to please fill in the feedback form to get your certificate of attendance, and I'll make sure I put it in the chat partway through the session for you. So thanks, Niraj, and I'll hand over to you.
Awesome. So welcome everyone. This is the final session. Again, apologies for not being able to do it last week, but we're here now in the end. So this is essentially just wrapping up, to be honest. By this point in your paper, you will be pretty much finished. So we're just going through the final bits and pieces to get it touched up and ready for submission. But before, as usual, just a quick introduction to NMRA for anyone who's new or if you've forgotten. So NMRA I founded in 2022. It's a non-profit aiming to give students and young academics, you don't even have to be a medic, but as anyone who wants to do medical research, you get a foundation. We teach you to be independent. We teach you to learn all the skills and have all the resources you need and create those opportunities for you guys. One of those is obviously the mentorship scheme. We've launched that now, so a chunk of you, if not all of you, will have some involvement with the mentorship scheme. And that's kind of your way to, I guess, apply the things that we're teaching you. If you're in the scheme, you'll know that the planning documents that are in all your groups are mapped according to this. So step 10 of your mentorship program is also this lecture 10 today. So they kind of map across. So if you're keeping track for your own project, then you're nearly at the end. But so this is the series. As you can tell, we've done all of this, and unfortunately we didn't do it by the 4th of July, but nevertheless, we've covered every single step from start to finish. We've done finding a question, we've done your protocol, we've done screening, we've done risk of bias, we've got all the data we needed, we've done meta-analysis, and we've done results and write-up. So we have essentially a full completed first draft. And the final step we're going to cover today is getting ready for submission. As I've kind of written on the screen, the aim is to give you all the tools you need to successfully conduct a systematic meta-analysis, and you can be engaged in all the steps. So the final step it is today. So I always have this slide. You'll kind of see a trend. But yeah, from a previous session, we've interpreted the results and we've written up the full SRMA. And so we have a draft. Now we need to think about what do we do with submission to journals and what do we do about the publication process. So to start off with, before we even think about going to a journal, the first question you need to ask yourself is my manuscript actually ready? Is it good enough? Because the last thing you want is that you submit or you start thinking about the journal process, but your manuscript requires more edits and it's just not at the right level. What that will lead to is obviously the journal will be sending your paper back to you and saying this isn't of a sufficient quality, maybe it's not formatted right, and it just doesn't look great for you, but also it's just more effort that you would have done anyway. So instead of having them tell you that, I think it's important that we go through what is required, and then you can avoid that unnecessary back and forth. So first off, this is essentially from a really good paper I liked. It's from Wenzel and Dunster and Lindner. This is something called it's a really good guide. Actually, you should read this. It's called a step-by-step guide to writing a manuscript. And essentially, what they've put here is these are 9 steps that will lead to your paper being immediately rejected. So when you submit, the way it normally works is you send your journal article into the journal, and they will initially read it from an editorial perspective. So they will verify that it's formatted correctly. It's verified that it checks out with like the word count and some referencing rules and all the other requirements they have. And they will check for each journal will have their own kind of criteria, but these are like the generalized versions. So they'll say, well, is the question actually any good? Is the work actually original? Has anyone done this before? Or is it just an implausible study? Like, are the studies the questions being answered just ridiculous for what they've done? If there's something severely and obviously wrong, the paper will not be taken for peer review. They will just send it straight back to you because they just think it's not good enough at this stage.
Niraj, just to interrupt there, could you share your PowerPoint?
I did. Hang on. What slide are you on?
We can't see the PowerPoint at the moment. Fab, we can see that.
Okay, so we've done this, we've done this, we've done this. We're here. Fine. So before we think about going to a journal, we need to know if it's any good. And this is what I was talking about, rapid rejection criteria. So Wenzel, Dunza, Lindner, they will talk to you about all the steps you need to know for a manuscript. Not explicitly stated, but it's always, every journal has like a rough copy of this, and they'll check for this within the work. And if not, then the paper will get rejected back to you, and they'll say, well, hang on, there's something obviously wrong here. It doesn't fit with peer review, and we're not sure that what you've suggested in this manuscript is actually even plausible. It's just, there's something obviously wrong with it. So the editorial team will first check that before anything happens. And then, so the first things you should do when you have a first draft is yourself and amongst your team, reread it and make sure you don't miss any of these things. And it can be a bit challenging sometimes because when you read your own work, there's this kind of bias of it makes sense to you because it's the way that you've written it, which is why I think a second perspective can be really helpful. Sometimes it can be really helpful to just explain what you've done to someone else and say, well, what do you think of this? And if they start asking you questions about the work being done before, or if the work not making sense, or the samples being off, whatever it may be, that's when you're going to find these rapid rejection criteria kind of things. In mentorship, the way I'm kind of doing this with you guys is all the groups are at the stage where they're coming up with the project idea. I think a good, well-constructed research question will dodge every single one of these, because the question being asked will automatically be novel, interesting, worth asking. And if the question is structured appropriately, there will be a clear hypothesis of A drug being better than B drug, or whatever the hypothesis is, depending on the style of the question. And in line with that, we will formulate obviously the methodology, the study sample, all these things. So 1 through 6, I think, can be done just with a good research question. 7, 8, and 9 are the ones where that's to do with your write-up and your interpretation. If you have interpreted your data correctly and written up the appropriate things, you'll be in good stead. The next thing I want to cover is specifically for systematic review meta-analysis is the PRISMA checklist. This is actually a requirement for a few journals now. So just the other day, I submitted to BMJ for a systematic review protocol that we're doing, and they asked us to do PRISMA checklist, which is really interesting because obviously protocols are actually future tense. It's talking about the work we will do in the future, but they still ask us to specify all these things: inclusion criteria, the rationale for the review, what methods are used to collect data. All these things kind of line up with the stuff that we've covered in previous lectures, but you have to very explicitly mention when you mentioned them. So you have to give location where item is reported. That's typically done in terms of a line. So what you do for your manuscript is you'll turn on the line number. So and it will just keep going on. And then you'll say, well, line 123 in the methods section refers to my risk of bias, and then you put that down there. So it helps you to know that you didn't miss anything and you've covered everything, but also it's required by journals. And most importantly, it gives a reader a kind of a quick fire way to check out every single thing they need. And, you know, if you're reading a review for your own purposes as a researcher, that might make your life easier, because if you want to know, well, you know, what kind of things did you look for in terms of effect measures? Let's say you want to know what did they check. Well, then just check what line it is and just don't waste your time. Just scroll straight to that. That makes your life easier as well. So it's good for transparency. It's good for ease of navigation. And it's just good to make sure that you are being as thorough as possible when you're doing your review. So that stuff is really important. So yeah, if between these two, if you verified that your paper doesn't fail any of these and it covers every single thing on the PRISMA checklist, at least methodically, you can say that it was sound. And that's a really good place to be, because it means the review was well conducted. It answered a decent question. It probably had some kind of value to the literature. So those are all really positive signs. And then, you know, at that point, I'd say, well, your journal article is probably good to send off. And, you know, at that point, you have to just see what the journal will say. I've also added in the other half to show you that for the PRISMA guideline is not just methodological, it's actually for everything. So you've got to specify the results, you've got to specify, you know, when you reported the synthesis, what kind of biases you found, what you did in discussion. And you'll notice it's very thorough, right? So discuss limitations for evidence included in the review, limitation of review processes, and finally, implications for practice, policy, and future research. So if you remember the last lecture I did 2 weeks ago, you'll start to see that this PRISMA checklist maps on really well with the stuff that we covered. It kind of forms a skeleton of the best things to mention and how that will look. And then there are other things as well. So, for example, you've got competing interests, financial support, you know, report whether the following are available in terms of data collection forms, data extracted, analytical code, any other material used in the review. A lot of people, as a rule of thumb, will not give this out because they think it's proprietary to them. So then, therefore, they don't make it publicly available. However, if you really need it for some purpose to verify what they did or what they got data from, you can always contact the corresponding author of the study and say, well, I went through your study. I wanted to know where you got this particular piece of data. Do you mind sharing that with me? And, you know, they will, depending on whether they have it or not and what happened to that study, they might be able to help you out there. So things like that, they're not specifically to do with your write-up, but they're things that you should have in the back of your mind. You know, you want to be able to have all your tables, your PRISMA flowchart. You want to have your code, your search strategies, potentially any analyses you did. You want to explain what you did and maybe some code, but it's unlikely that you give the code because it can be proprietary. So things like that are very important. And yeah, the depth in which you cover all this will reveal very strongly in terms of how that goes. And it goes to show the preparedness with which your article was written and how it's going to be presented to the reviewer team. So yeah, that's it really for, I guess, knowing that your quality of your work is there. What else do we need? So first things first, verify author guidelines for formatting and structure and what you need to include. Typically, the things you will include are these three. So you have tables and figures. Journals often will say put this in a separate document, or sometimes they'll say put them at the end of your document and then just put like a little placeholder. So, you know, you obviously in your text, you'll kind of just put like table 1 in brackets, but where table 1 should be in your manuscript, you'll just leave like the header. So just say table 1, study characteristics of included studies. So that marks where that should be within your overall manuscript. But the table itself will be either it might be at the end or it might be in a separate document. Alternatively, some journals might not ask you to do that at all. And then when you go into proofing, they'll ask you to then just check that was put in a reasonable place. Supplementary material. So anything in the supplement is essentially anything that you need to refer to, but you're not going to actually specifically put within your manuscript. It's not something that belongs in a table or a figure or in the main text. So stuff like risk of bias or research strategy, there's nowhere in your manuscript where you would reasonably put that. So you just put in the supplement. It's available for people to read and to access, especially online these days. So like the online version of the journal article will have that. And then as a result of that, it saves space, and people reading your manuscript don't have all that extra stuff to look through. But if they want to check it out, they can do. Because, for example, search strategy, you're going to describe it in the method section, and then you'll just say, well, the full thing is available within the supplementary. So again, the reason it's there is for transparency, and so someone can theoretically replicate your work. Being able to do that doesn't mean that it's necessarily in your face. It just needs to be there. And last but not least is the cover letter. Cover letters are not fancy. All they do is they tell the editor of the journal why they should consider your particular piece of work. So you're going to tell them things like what your work achieves, why it's novel, why it's important to know about in the context of other work that's been done or other policies that are being implemented or other future research that may be required. And as a result of that, you then talk about why this journal in particular should take it. Maybe you're going to reference the fact that this journal has commented on previous work in the field and they have an interest in that field, therefore. Or maybe you'll speak to the specific region by which that journal is published in and how that's relevant to where you're publishing. Factors like that show them to the journal, that this work is particularly relevant to its readers. Because at the end of the day, a journal is just a medium by which you're sharing your results to your potential audience. So you've got to think quite strategically in the sense of, am I going to get the right people on board? So, I'm going to go into this in a bit more depth. So first off, I want to show you some author guidelines. This is going to be, so this is from, I think this is from BMJ Sports Medicine. I don't know why I picked that one in particular. It's just a random one that came up when I Googled it. But my point is that this is everything you'll need to do from their perspective. So they've said it should be around 4,000 to 4,500 words with a maximum word count up to 4. They want an abstract of up to 250, and that is structured in a particular way. So the key things to bear in mind, so they've said the literature search needs to be done. Prisma checklist must be provided and should accompany submission in a supplementary material. And all systematic reviews must address every item in the Prisma statement. So you've got to cover the whole thing. The second bit that's important is you've got to have the title saying systematic review. You've got a structure of 250-word abstract with headings such as objective, design, data sources, eligibility criteria, and results and conclusion. So essentially, this is a bit of a clunky way to do it, but they've broken down the study a little bit. So you've got the objective is just your introduction. It's why you're doing the study. Design, data sources, and eligibility criteria are just methods, but broken up. So your design will say, well, we're going to do a systematic review meta-analysis. We're going to follow Prisma. And then data sources will say, we're going to obtain data from such and such journal, Ovid, Scopus, Medline. And then eligibility criteria, you're just going to say, well, we're going to screen studies that include RCTs. They might be for such and such type of patient who had a certain drug treatment, or whatever that may be. In a normal abstract methods, you would cover that anyway. It's just because it's this specific journal you're submitting to, you've got to do it their way. And if you don't, they'll send it back to you and say, do it again. So just do it right the first time is the reason that you check all this stuff. Please include a summary box in 3 to 4 clear and specific words. What is already known and what are the new findings? So this is some journals do this. Like the BMJ does this. The Lancet has a section on this. You'll notice for every single submission they make. Essentially, it's just for the sake of the reader. If they don't know the field, You're going to summarize what's been done before, what's new from your study. That's it. It doesn't have to be in depth, and to be honest, it's not something that will be severely graded on in peer review. They're not going to say, well, why did you say that in your bullet points too much? Unless they're obviously wrong, of course. Systematic review registration, that's just put your Prospero number down if you have one. And if not, then first off, why don't you? And secondly, we'll think of there are other places you can send it. You could even publish a preprint and just have it out there in public domain. The main thing is you've got to think about why you're doing this and like who it's going to be disseminated to, and then being transparent about making sure everything's clear. The final point is a little bit odd. Please consider whether the topic warrants systematic review or whether scoping review would be more appropriate. You can go and check the guidance if you're curious. But in essence, what it kind of comes down to is what we've always talked about in this whole series. If you have a very specific research question you'd like to answer that has a very objective result and the way it's going to be done, you do that. Otherwise, if you're doing this to probe into what could be a good question and where it's going to go, you need to think about scoping review. Obviously, the guideline is more in depth, but that's kind of the summary. And then the final bits are, this is for your actual formatting. Word count 4,500, abstract 250, no more than 60 or figures, and up to 100 references. And Prisma checklist statement and flowchart. You've got to give both. You've got to do the checklist and also the flowchart. And then the last thing is just to bear in mind is 6 tables of figures can be a little bit challenging if you're doing meta-analysis. So that's why you want to minimize any extra things that are not going to be required to be tables or illustrations. You put that stuff, risk of bias, search strategies, anything extra that doesn't fit in, like any extra patient data that you can avoid putting, put any of that extra stuff in the supplement, because supplement doesn't count towards this. So that's why you've got to be really careful with what is worth presenting. Even with word count, 4,500 feels like a lot, but a lengthy discussion section explaining a good amount of detail for a meta-analysis, you will hit that pretty soon. So these things are important to remember because they teach you and they inform you of how you will write your paper and what it will become. So that's really important. This is a review we did. So this is just a cover letter example. Shreya actually got a couple of papers out of NMRA. So she was a mentee in 2022. But yeah, so we wrote this paper. This is a little bit of an unusual one. It's not something I've talked about too much in the series. I'll probably cover this in a future lecture at some point. But systematic review of clinical practice guidelines. We really like these in NMRA. They're awesome. They are super beneficial because they start to tackle tough concepts such as, are guidelines any good in this area? Are they congruent? Do different countries recommend different things? Do they look at different evidence? It's really important, right? Because you want to make sure that what you're studying has a great amount of value. So this is structured a lot like a letter. And we use that to structure how we do things. First off, top left corner, you mention who you're addressing. You give a subject line, and then you say, "Dear Professor, we're happy to submit our journal article," and then we put the title for this journal. And then we explain what's important. So deep brain stimulation can be used for OCD. Our study aims to explore and assess quality of guidelines for DBS. We identify differences, and we also identify different valid. This agree to is just a risk of bias score in the risk of is in how good these guidelines are. We also found that they failed to acknowledge cost effectiveness. So this is our key results. We've said guidelines are inconsistent. They don't mention cost effectiveness, and quality appraisal of them varies quite a lot. They do really well on scope and editorial independence, but they're not that great on applicability, which is quite damning for an actual guideline, to be honest, because if they're not applicable, what do they do? Who are they guiding, right? So, yeah, while DBS is a newly emerging technology, we've kind of said, well, it needs more attention, and there's no previous review of guidelines. It's the first one, and we believe because of that, it's going to be important to the journal, because this is the British Journal of Psychiatry. We want them to publish this so that they will be able to get this out to their audience, who are all psychiatrists who will potentially be using this therapy, right? So yeah, the other thing that I need to mention is, so we've said declaration of interest, none. Some journals will have like a whole spiel for you to write. They'll say you need to put down like declaration of conflict of interest. Some of them might say you need to specify that the work's not ever been submitted to any other journal. They might even want you to say that, declare any funding that all the journals received and the work received. I guess they do that. It's already on the manuscript anyway, but they'd make you do it again so that you're declaring it specifically to the editor when you're submitting. So it's for transparency. And then you sign off like any other letter would. You sign off with your name, where you're from, and you say for and behalf of all co-authors, because this is the corresponding author, who is just the author who submits and deals with the journal on behalf of everyone else. Typically, the corresponding author is often the most senior person or the person who did all the work, because they're probably going to know the most about the topic, and they're most capable of responding to author queries. They're also the people who officially have to write about, they're also the people who officially have to write about the, what am I trying to say? Officially have to write it back about peer review. So obviously they need to know the field as much as possible. Give me a second. Sorry, Beck. That was awkward. But yes, so hide, present. Oh, you don't see that? Oh boy. I'm gonna get. Where was I? Yes. So we've done cover letters. They're not too complicated. The main thing is just be confident about why your work is significant and what it really adds to the literature. Once that's obvious, they're not going to turn you down. Also, I should say, a cover letter does not make or break any decision about your work. They won't say, oh, this cover letter was terrible, we're not going to touch this paper. It's not like that. This is, in essence, an introduction to your work, but the work will always speak for itself. Just to carry on, identifying an appropriate journal. It's important to consider both the journal which is likely to consider your work and publish it, but also work that actually reach your desired audience. So there's a few things to consider. You have the scope of the journal, the indexation impact factor, what kind of funding and open access options you have, and journal acceptance metrics. So to start off with, I'm going to show you a journal and talk about where you find this information. So this is a journal we've published in before, the European. Essentially, aims and scope tells you what kind of journals, articles they want, and what they are publishing for, and to whom that work goes, right? So this is quality of care and clinical outcomes. Essentially, they want care most about clinical outcomes, and they care a lot about quality of care, right? So as they've said here, it's about quality of care. It's about forum for showcasing the best outcomes research to inform public health policy globally. And what they want, exemplar topics of relevance, are novel treatment strategies, electronic health record prognosis research and cost-effective analysis, and a global perspective with focus on policy consequences and quality of life are important to their publication within the journal. So what they're telling you is, present something to us that will add value to the literature, in specifically regarding outcomes for cardiovascular disease, outcomes for cost effectiveness, and something that is going to be important when we make public health policy about cardiovascular health, which is why these guys are our number one choice for reviews of guidelines, because we think, well, clinical practice guideline being assessed is a massive public health policy thing, because we can update guidelines for the future, and people who make those guidelines should know about this so that they can modify and talk about cost effectiveness and prognosis research, which is exactly what we covered in the previous slide here, when we said about, we said there's different recommendations for tailoring to characteristics and outcomes, and also cost effectiveness is lacking. So based on what you see in front of you, you find a journal that matches. Very simple. And on top of that, for extra confirmation, what you can do is you can verify other previously published studies in your field and check what kind of journals those go to. Because if you're publishing in the same field about a similar thing, those are the kind of appropriate journals that will fit you. And it's unlikely by the time your journal article comes out and theirs did, in that time, they're not going to change scope. Scope is very overarching. So 9 times out of 10, that's a good metric to go by. But yeah, the other thing I want to cover here is kind of impact factor and ranking. Some researchers get really worked up about this. And I can understand why. It feels a bit like gamifying what you work on sometimes. It's like, I got this many citations and my work therefore is so relevant. And the impact factor of this journal is so good, so I'm getting into really good journals, that kind of thing. It can feel like a metric that you need to do well on. And it is, in some regards. But first off, before we comment on that, I think it's important to just say, well, actually, what does impact factor mean? So in essence, all it is it's an average number of citations earned by the papers within that journal. So in 2023, the average number of citations received by journals from articles from this journal were 4.8, which is number 43 out of all the 220 cardiac journals out there in the world. So pretty good, right? 4.8. So you're saying the average paper in this article gets 85 citations. That's pretty good, right? Because, I mean, bear in mind, the average across all journals is less than 1. It's 0.5 or something. It's really bad. Because you have to remember, publishing is kind of, it's kind of like, you get like this very big extreme of some articles get hundreds of citations. And those are really important ones, often, or the best conducted ones, the ones with the most significance. So those might be things like trials, really important meta-analyses, guideline papers, that kind of thing. They're really important. And the reason they get cited again and again is because they act as a foundation for other stuff to be built on top of it. So for example, if you are involved in writing a trial, that trial might then lead to people studying other specific things. They might do subgroup analysis. They might comment on your trial and do, like a commentary piece. The guidelines for that field might refer back to your guideline. Someone might do a meta-analysis and include your guideline. Lots of things will cite you. So it feeds in really well. But then equally, there are papers that don't get cited as much, such as maybe letters to the editor, commentary pieces. Certain reviews don't get cited that much because they don't chain themselves onto other research. If I write a commentary about why such and such trial was conducted badly, I might get a response from the guy doing the trial, but outside of that, no one's going to repeatedly refer to my work because I made a point and that's it. The point stands on its own. My point doesn't then lead to someone else doing additional study and citing me. So for every journal article that gets 100 citations, there might be dozens that don't get even more than 10 citations. And what I'm trying to tell you is that you have to take this average with a grain of salt. It is a proxy metric for the reach of the journal and how much it can act as a platform for your paper, because there are some articles that do really well and some that don't. And hence, there's no such thing as a good impact factor. I remember working with someone once who said that they wouldn't read a paper unless the journal was published and had an impact factor of more than 4. And funnily enough, when we wrote up the final manuscript, I actually went back and counted. 0 papers in that review had an impact factor of more than 4. And that is a funny anecdote, I think. But what it tells me is that this whole thing was silly. It didn't achieve anything because we obviously thought that those papers were good enough for the review. They did fine on risk of bias. They were impactful. They were relevant to our research question. So we used them anyway. The journal impact factor didn't affect our decision to do it. It might have made those papers easier to find and more well spread, but the quality of the work doesn't reflect necessarily on the impact factor or vice versa. But that's not to say that an impact factor is meaningless, right? Because journals that are protective of the impact factor and do really well, so like the Lancet, they are genuinely stricter on what they take. They're more selective. They have more strict peer review process. A colleague of mine who submitted to the Lancet, they had to sit there review their paper with 7 peer reviewers. That's unheard of in most journals. But because they're so strict on what they take, they really went for it because they thought we need to be certain this is the right paper for us. So that does happen, but it's not normal. It's just it's an artifact of them just publishing really good work and making sure they continue to do that. So there is a link between the two, but it's not like one causes the other, and it's not bidirectional, I don't think. But funding. This is a big one. So this is a spreadsheet from the Oxford. Yeah, this is from Oxford University Press. So they have hundreds of journals that they publish in from the press. And for every single one, if you want to publish open access, they'll ask you for an APC, which is an article processing charge. It's a strange concept to get your head around. But in essence, if you don't want your paper to be behind a paywall, you pay for it. Which is really, a bit of an unusual thing to get your head around. Because I don't think you're used to that when you go to like a shop or something. But that's how it works here. So, yeah, when we speak about APCs, this is kind of the ballpark figure. It's 2, 3, 4, 5,000, depending on where you submit. That's kind of standard price. That is not abnormal. Now, again, this is for open access. There are loads of journals that do either hybrid access, which means you get open and closed, or just closed. And those are fine. They'll be free because they'll make their money through people buying subscription and reading your paper. Which is why, for a lot of you guys who are at university or in hospitals, you have institutional access. Your institution and your library pays a lot of money to these journals so that you can read unlimited papers. But yeah, a license is offered. It's just copyright. So you have CC BY, CC BY NC, and CC BY NC ND. That doesn't really matter too much at this stage. The main reason that it's mentioned is because if you're using funding, so for example, for my PhD, they require CC BY NC. That's just what they need to fund the publication APC. And you've got to check that stuff in advance. Because if not, then you've got to start carefully picking and choosing what journals are appropriate to you. If you don't have funding, for example, that covers CC BY, and you need to do CC BY NC, you need to start ticking off. You've got to find an appropriate journal out of the full list, but then you've got to ignore the ones that don't have this criteria met. So the more that you look into journals, it's not just what's relevant, it's also what can you afford. There are like these conflicting often results that you need to cover, but it's important to think about early. Your institution or hospital will often have like funds for this stuff. You can always speak to like a librarian team. They'll be able to guide you. If you're on a funded program, like a PhD or some kind of grant, then again, you can speak to them and they'll probably allow you to pay for this stuff using that, provided that licenses are met and things. So for example, for my PhD, they will only pay for it if it's in an open access journal, and open access is available publicly within 6 months. So hybrid journals, I don't think they'd pay for, because they'd just say, well, just publish it closed access. They want it to be a fully open access journal, ideally. But yeah, so again, your funding will specify, please check. And then journal statistics, the final thing to cover. So BMJ Open, again, we published there previously, so I just copy and pasted it then. But yeah, so acceptance rate is just how many papers they take out of what they get submitted. 36% is actually pretty good. Most of these are in a 10%, 20% kind of range. They're a lot lower. So 36% tells you that these guys are actually quite keen to take work, regardless of where it comes from, provided it's of sufficient quality. There is also some kind of selection bias, I assume, because you wouldn't publish to BMJ if you didn't think your paper was good. So I reckon a lot of not so great papers just find themselves elsewhere. And then, so that's kind of relevant, because if you're submitting to somewhere that has like a 5% acceptance rate, you need to think, well, they don't take 19 out of 20 Does that mean I need to be really careful about how good my paper is? Maybe you do. That would always kind of make me a little bit cautious. And the other thing to think about is time to decision. So that kind of just tells you how fast the journal will handle your work. So let's go through this. So time to decision without review, that applies in two scenarios. Either your work doesn't need a review, so it's like a letter to the editor or something. It just doesn't need to be peer reviewed, or it's going to be sent back to you before peer review because you've missed something on editorial stage. So in that case, they'll get back to you in 4 days, which is really good. That could be the same week. They'll get back to you. Awesome. And then the second part is time to decision with review. Pretty much every systematic review meta-analysis we touch will cover this, because I've never ever seen a journal that doesn't peer review systematic review meta-analysis. It just is a thing that needs to be done. It's very appropriate methodologically for a journal to verify, whether your work was any good. So it makes sense. So they're saying that they can get your work back to you with a decision from review within 3.5 months, 105 days. So that's actually pretty quick. I always tell people expect at least 3 months, maybe closer to 5 or 6. So that's not bad. 3.5 is fairly fast. But do bear in mind, this will double, because your work will very rarely be accepted on the first decision. There will always be comments that are raised by peer reviewers. And if there are comments, it's very likely that the journal will say, address the comments and send it back to us, if they think the work is worth it. So peer reviewers, when they mark your work, they will give comments, and then they'll be asked to give a judgment. So the judgment will be reject, accept, or accept subject to peer review comments. So if they have any substantial comments about your work, they'll say accept with subject to comments. Reject just means, they didn't like the paper at all. It has something wrong with it methodologically, something like that. Maybe it's not original, but maybe it needs work. And then accept first time is very rare, because there's no way that it's very unlikely to have work that is so well crafted that you've covered everything, right? Your peer reviewers are a third party source. They're going to see differently to you do. I'd say 90% of papers don't get accepted on first decision, if not more. So because of that, you will then have to go back, redo your edits, amend your paper accordingly, respond to peer reviewers, and then send it back. And then by the time the peer reviewers verify that you've answered all their questions and they're happy with it, they will then send the work to the journal team, who will then say yes or no again. So you've got to go through this most likely 2 cycles. So we're talking 210 days, which is 7 months. And that's after your first draft is ready, your second draft is ready, and then fully finalized. Yeah. And then at the very end, acceptance of publication. So that is essentially just a little process. Essentially, your work gets converted from a Word document to the fancy PDFs that you see when you click on like the Lancet, BMJ, whatever. That process is called proofing. It takes them a bit of a while to get everything typeset and put into that fancy format. And sometimes they have to redraw or edit your figures and tables sometimes. And then they'll send it to you as a proof, which just means you proofread it and you verify you're happy with what they've done. And then they also then got to upload it, send it out to indexation, things like that. So that process, 21 days is about reasonable. I always say expect it to be nearly a month or thereabouts. So 21 days is pretty good. But all in all, just do some quick maths, right? 105 times 2 plus 21 is 231 days. That's pretty much 8 months after you finish your work. And your systematic review itself probably will take 6, 8, 9 months to write. So from the conception of your work to publication, we're talking at least a year, maybe more, depending on the journal and depending on other factors. So I'm trying to illustrate to you that this is very important, because you need to have that time scale in your head, and you need to know the journal will actually live up to that. Because if you have a journal who says our average time to first edition is 180 days, that slows everything down. So you've got to think about that stuff in advance. But peer review. I've kind of touched on this already a little bit, but I want to go into it properly. Peer review is a vital step. It ensures your paper is actually any good. It ensures that you add value to literature. Typically, you get 2 or 3. 7 from the Lancet is not normal. It's really not. And then, yeah, they will decide whether your work gets accepted. But it can be overridden by the editor-in-chief of the journal and the editorial team. They can choose to have your paper even if the reviewers don't like it, or vice versa. And if the journal thinks your work is of interest, they'll ask you to respond to review comments and resubmit. So I want to show you peer review feedback that I got for a manuscript of mine, just to show you what kind of things they say. So this is for a review we did, just discharge pathways for patients with, I think they were going through cardiology for TAVI. Yeah, for TAVI. So essentially, we've kind of compared early discharge and normal discharge pathways, and we want to see what the difference is. So, so the peer reviewers kind of said, well, in the case of what we're doing, what's the criteria? How does ED make any difference? And what do we define ED to be? So he's answered these 3 questions. And then he said, well, you've answered question 2, because obviously if you do a meta-analysis, you can show, is there any difference in mortality and morbidity, post-op complications, that kind of thing. We can identify that very obviously. What criteria should be used for patients? That's tough, because, here they've said they probably have information but don't present it. What they mean is, when you did your systematic review, could you extract this stuff from papers that talked about pathways? Probably. So he's like, maybe you have it. And finally saying, well, did you have any comments about expanding criteria? Because was that something that was mentioned within the studies itself? Maybe. And so, so he's kind of saying, well, methodologically, these are questions you should answer and you should think about. And that's actually really important, right? That teaches you a lot. They're interesting things. They show you that actually selection bias and discharge in structure of it is important. So ED population is highly selected, it results in better outcomes. It doesn't result in better outcomes. They're right, because the act of discharging someone doesn't improve their care. It's like saying the reason they're being discharged early is because they're actually well quicker, which is a good thing. But we didn't do anything to get them well faster. They just happened to have that anyway, and we just sent them off on their way quicker. So what we are testing is not, does ED make things better? It's just safe. It's fine. So the wording, was not right, and he rightly flagged that up. Then balance of benefits, again, you were studying retrospective. This one's a bit annoying, but again, he has a point. And then different cutoffs for ED. That's because different studies report different things. And so he's like, well, actually, why? Let's go into why. And did you not include this analysis? Well, we didn't, because it wasn't appropriate. It didn't meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria. But that's where we get to respond, because we don't have to say every single thing they say is right. We have to respond in accordance with what we think is best. Because peer reviewers, at the end of the day, didn't do a systematic review. You remember, they are only reading the manuscript. They're commenting on it from their fresh perspective. So they might not know everything. And as a result, we have to respond. So this is what we said. I said, well, listen, you've made some salient points. So it's challenging to interpret, number one, because ED is different across every single study. There's no consistent practice and there's no guidelines. So we can't thoroughly examine this because the criteria don't exist. So I've said, well, we believe this is a pertinent area for future articles to explore. So sometimes peer reviewers have a point, but I can't do anything about that. So I've just got to say, well, I'm sorry, I can't fix that. It is what it is. But if I don't make this rebuttal and argue this, we're never going to know, right? So yeah, another one is, this is when we submitted for well-being. This was published like 2 months ago. Just another example. So here, sometimes the points are really pedantic, right? So they've said, you've used the word understand, which overstates the possibility of such a review. Ironic, but anyway. So yeah, maybe it'd be better to say just delineate, describe, outline, because the thing, you can't get a research paper to achieve understand. Pedantic, but fair enough, right? If that's how you feel, if we're going to say that research papers can only present information and understanding is not part of what the paper can achieve, valid. We'll change it, and we did. The key thing I want to point out here is that when we change text in the manuscript, we copy and paste it here. So we put it in the review, in the response document, so that the editorial team and the peer reviewers can specifically see what we've done and why. And so therefore there's transparency, because otherwise I could just change nothing, tell them I've changed everything, and then the manuscript just goes through, right? The whole point of this is to be as transparent as possible about how we are improving our science and how we are communicating that in the most effective way to the audience. That's very important, because otherwise, what's the point of a peer review process? We're just going to just lie our way through it. But yeah, so some of these things can feel very silly, but they're important. And yeah, also, not everything is a negative that you have to respond to. So this stuff, it's a well-structured, well-presented plan. It's important to consider international perspectives, and methods are clear and appropriate. That's a good thing. So, I mean, we could respond and say thank you, but you don't have to actually respond to that, because they're being nice to you. Like, they're acknowledging the good things in your paper, and they will. You know, not everything they say is negative. There are also some things that they're reviewing your work and saying, well, that was fine. You did a good job there. But yeah, and what I'm trying to illustrate here is that a peer reviewer is not out to just reject your paper. They're just giving you an honest assessment of what they perceive it to be from what they're reading. And yeah, that's pretty much it, to be honest. You know, once you've dealt with this and you've cleared it through, your paper will be accepted most likely, and proceed from there. But yeah, I can imagine this is a very understudied topic. Not everyone comments on it too much, but especially for you guys in mentorship scheme, I definitely think if you have any questions, you want to go through this with me, I'm happy to take any questions and happy to stick around and help you get through this process as much as possible. But yeah, I'm gonna just stop sharing so I can look at questions. Cool. What's here? Okay, I can't see any questions other than the whole thing about my slides. So yeah, if everyone's happy and you're good to go, then fantastic. It's been awesome to speak to you guys. And honestly, I had a lot of fun doing this whole series. So I hope that from this tour, we've covered everything in systematic review meta-analysis that is kind of immediately relevant. If there's anything else that crops up, I will probably end up doing a few follow-up sessions about like conferences and a few other bits and pieces. We will fix that. And then secondly, obviously for the people doing the mentorship program, feel free to revisit these and just come back to them as and when you need them, because you're going to be doing these steps pretty soon. So hopefully that's all helpful. And yeah, thanks again for coming, everyone.